For years, Canada has wrestled with an overdose crisis, with thousands of people succumbing to the deadly effects of toxic drugs like fentanyl. But there's a second brewing crisis involving those who don't die after overdosing. I'm Dave Breckenridge, and this is 10-3. Ottawa Sun reporter Andrew Duffy joins me to discuss the effects a non-fatal overdose can have on a person, how that may manifest in an already vulnerable population, and what stresses it can put on the healthcare system. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So Andrew, as many people know, every major city and every province in Canada has been dealing with some version of the toxic drugs crisis over the last number of years, with overdoses killing thousands of people. Looking at the situation in Ottawa where you're based, how many people have died over the last couple of years there?
Yeah, we've had about 500 people die here in the last 3 years. So it's got steadily worse in each of the last 6 or 7 years. And right now, I mean, there's no sign yet of that changing.
For people who may not understand how drugs involved in this crisis work, specifically fentanyl, how does it affect the body? What happens when someone takes fentanyl or other opioids, and what happens when someone overdoses that causes someone to die?
Well, I mean, fentanyl has a powerful effect on the body. And in medicine, fentanyl is used as a very powerful painkiller. And it's used to relieve severe pain in medicine. When it's taken recreationally, it has some of that same effect. I mean, it relieves pain. But when there's an overdose, it acts on the brainstem. And the brainstem is where the body's control of breathing is centered. And so when there's an overdose of fentanyl, it attaches to the receptors in that part of the brain and interrupts the natural flow of breathing. And sometimes it means your breathing becomes more shallow. Sometimes it means it stops. But that's what makes fentanyl so dangerous and what can lead to disastrous and sometimes fatal overdoses.
But as you've discovered in your reporting, and as we know, just based on the fact that we hear often about overdoses being reversed or overdoses being treated, not every overdose is fatal. And as some are reversed with interventions like naloxone, and some lead to hospitalization. Based on your reporting, what does the known data show in terms of overdose reversals at places like supervised consumption sites or in terms of hospitalizations?
Well, I mean, some of it, the research is still being done, but basically, for every one fatal overdose, researchers have found that there's 15 to 20 non-fatal ones. And so, in other words, in Canada, some 44,000 people have died from fatal overdoses since 2016. And then when you do the math and extrapolate that, it means there have been more than 650,000 non-fatal overdoses. And so what researchers are increasingly concerned about, and people who work in the drug community are increasingly concerned about, is the fact that when you have that many overdoses and that many people survive overdoses, that some of them are going to suffer brain damage by virtue of the hypoxia involved in an overdose. Because when you overdose, your breathing shallows. Sometimes it stops completely. And research shows that it only takes a few minutes before you start to suffer neuronal damage, until you start to suffer brain damage, because your neurons require oxygen. And when there's an insufficient supply of oxygen to the brain, that's when you start to suffer brain damage. And that is a relatively quick process. And so unless you deliver naloxone within those first couple of minutes, people can suffer brain damage. And when you just look at the huge number of overdoses in the country, you have to consider that a significant percentage of the people that survive those overdoses are suffering brain damage.
And when we look at these non-fatal overdoses and we look at the mechanism for injury that you describe, what are the risks associated with someone who's had an hypoxic brain injury? Is it cognitive delay? Is it physical symptoms? Like what do those injuries look like?
Yeah, I mean, they're like any kind of significant brain injury. You often see significant brain injuries and strokes, sometimes in heart attacks. And as it relates to hypoxic brain injury, they generally experience trouble with attention, with memory, motor coordination, emotional dysregulation, decision making, problem solving. And all of those things make it more difficult to manage and to treat people who are addicted to drugs.
And do we have a sense of how many people who've had a non-fatal overdose who have either been hospitalized or had it reversed elsewhere have suffered injuries like this, or is there a best guess that officials have?
Yeah, this is where it gets a little tricky. I mean, there have been several academic studies in Canada that have tried to identify the scope of the problem, but it's difficult. And identifying brain injuries that are directly related to overdoses is sort of an inexact science. But there's been sort of two significant efforts. One was in BC in 2023, and there was a study that examined 824,000 people whose information was randomly selected from provincial health databases. And what they did, they basically tried to understand how many people had been diagnosed with a hypoxic brain injury. And it basically concluded that people who had suffered drug overdoses were 15 times more likely to have also suffered some kind of hypoxic brain injury. It doesn't tell us that much. It just simply tells us that there's a significant correlation between suffering a hypoxic brain injury and also suffering an overdose. There was another piece of federal research in 2019, 2020, and then looked at more than 4,000 opioid-related hospitalizations across the country during that time. And what they found was that out of all those hospitalizations for drug overdoses, about 4.2% of the people admitted for overdoses were also diagnosed with a hypoxic brain injury. And so that's probably our best estimate as to the scope of the problem. But there are some people who work in the community who think that probably underestimates the scope of the problem too, insofar as a lot of people who suffer overdoses don't go to hospital. And once they're in hospital, a lot of overdose patients aren't assessed for a brain injury. And so there's every chance that 4.2% figure is likely an underestimation of the problem.
We'll be right back. So when it comes to tracking some of these things, are advocates calling for better screening when they're dealing with overdoses in hospitals, or when even at supervised consumption sites when overdoses are being reversed? Are they suggesting that patients be referred to hospital for assessment for things like a hypoxic brain injury?
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, one of the few researchers in Canada who's studying this issue is a guy at the University of Victoria named Mauricio Garcia Barrera. He's a neuropsychologist. And that's exactly what he's calling for. He wants doctors and, ambulance attendants to routinely assess overdose victims for some kind, for brain damage, for some kind of hypoxic injury, because he's convinced that, the sooner you offer these people treatment, the better their outcome.
You mentioned that, dealing with clients who have a brain injury and due to a non-fatal overdose can cause problems when you're trying to manage people with addictions issues or vulnerable people in the community. What kind of challenges are agencies facing in managing some of these clients?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is about, it's decision making. It's sort of the day-to-day ability to look after yourself. One of the people I interviewed talked about the fact that more and more the frontline workers are almost having to act like a second brain for some of the people involved. And the director of inner city health in Ottawa, Rob Boyd, gave me a very specific kind of example of what this means. Because people who are going through drug treatment, one of the most tried and true methods of drug treatment is methadone. But in order to be successful in a methadone problem, it means the individual has to keep coming back for treatment day after day after day after day. And Boyd has told me that that presents a real problem for people who have had a hypoxic brain injury. It's just very difficult for them to remember to do that and to motivate themselves to do that day after day after day. And he said that's why there has to be really specialized programs for people who have had these kind of hypoxic injuries, because they just need more assistance than most people.
What are provinces doing, if anything, to address some of these individuals who they perhaps need drug treatment, but they also have an injury that, as you say, kind of prevents them from managing their day-to-day life in that fashion?
Well, I mean, that's sort of a topic that's under some pretty intense discussion in a lot of the provinces right now. And in BC, the premier there, David Eby, he has vowed to open rehab facilities to provide involuntary care to people that are brain injured who also have severe addictions and mental illness. And he says this can be done under the authority of the Mental Health Act, but it's a controversial idea because it's basically forcing treatment upon people, and you have to have the places and the specialized care in place to offer them that kind of service. But that the whole idea of involuntary care, as it's called, is something that's being discussed in a lot of provinces, because I think people just don't know how to get out of the problem that we're seeing in some inner cities, and involuntary care seems to be one of the things that's up for discussion.
Right now in Ontario, there's a lot of scrutiny around supervised consumption sites. There's concerns about crime and social disorder occurring around these sites, and Premier Doug Ford has vowed to close a number of them. What are our advocates saying in relation to the idea that the sites may play a role in preventing people from suffering more severe brain injury than would happen if the sites were closed?
So one of the critical issues, is being able to deliver naloxone quickly. Because you only have a few minutes before brain damage potentially sets in once an overdose has occurred. And the thing that people who operate the supervised injection sites say is that no one suffers that kind of injury once they're inside a supervised injection site, because that's what they're there for. No one has died inside a supervised injection site for that very reason in Canada. But what's happened in recent years is that a lot of people aren't injecting opioids anymore; they're smoking them, and so they don't necessarily go inside a supervised injection site to consume anymore. They'll kind of hang around outside it and smoke opioids. But it means that they're overdosing outside the injection sites. And so in places like Ottawa, the staff at our biggest injection site, it's called the Trailer, and staff are constantly running outside to deliver naloxone to overdose victims outside the Trailer. And last year alone, there's more than 1,700 overdoses reversed at the Trailer, and most of those were outside the Trailer itself. And so so the people who run the supervised injection sites, are really worried about what's going to happen once the government closes, 10 of the sites in Ontario. That's what Doug Ford has proposed, or that's what he's plans on doing. And they're really worried about what's going to happen to them, because those people who are outside the supervised injection sites, or who are no longer in a supervised injection site because it's been eliminated, they're really worried about what's going to happen to them.
What do local politicians feel about the issue? I know there's often a debate between city level politicians and the province in terms of how some of these programs are operated. What are municipal politicians in Ottawa saying about the problem?
Well, I mean, there's some disagreement about how to approach the problem, but there's no doubt that local politicians here believe that social disorder is getting worse. I think what's happened, like when I wrote about the prevalence of brain injury among the drug using population, that it does help to explain that social disorder, because people are just harder to govern. It's harder for them to govern themselves. They have more emotional dysregulation, and that's one of the things that's contributing to that social disorder. Like one of the local politicians I talked to, talked about the fact that down in downtown Ottawa, there used to be sort of this moral code, if you want to call it that, among drug users. So that if kids or a family was approaching, everyone would put away their drug works, their needles and whatnot, and the family would pass. But that's not happening anymore. I mean, people are using in public now. They're using, around kids, sometimes around schoolyards, and that's something that's not happened in the past. It's something that I think is a function of the kind of disruption we've seen in the local drug using community, both because some of the older members of that community have died, the people that used to enforce that kind of moral code have died, and others have been have suffered brain damage, and other members of the community have become harder to manage for that same reason.
Well, I know it's a delicate issue, and it's one that's caused a lot of debate in Canada, but I appreciate the context that your piece brought to an issue that I think a lot of people are struggling to understand. Andrew, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest Andrew Duffy. More from him at ottawacitizen.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.